On the evening of August 12, 1985, Japan Airlines Flight 123 departed from Tokyo, carrying 524 souls on what should have been a routine one-hour journey to Osaka. Inside the aircraft, everything felt ordinary. Passengers relaxed in their seats, flight attendants smiled as they moved through the aisle, and the pilots guided the massive Boeing 747 into the summer sky with confidence. No one on board had any idea that within minutes they would be trapped inside a dying machine. 12 minutes after takeoff, a sudden explosion shattered the calm. It was loud enough to terrify everyone on board, but it wasn't the kind of explosion people usually imagine. It didn't destroy the plane instantly. Instead, it did something far worse. It crippled the aircraft and left it flying, broken, uncontrollable, and slowly sealing the fate of everyone inside. What followed was not an instant crash, but 32 minutes of terror. 32 minutes where passengers realized they might never see their families again. 32 minutes where some began writing goodbye letters. 32 minutes where pilots fought desperately to save a plane that no longer wanted to be saved. And when the aircraft finally fell from the sky and rescue teams arrived many hours later, they discovered something that made the tragedy even more horrifying. Some people had survived the crash. They were alive in the darkness. They had been waiting for help that never came in time. This is the story of Japan Airlines Flight 123 and the final 32 minutes that turned an ordinary flight into the deadliest single aircraft disaster in history. Japan Airlines Flight 123 was a domestic flight, something that happens every day without anyone thinking twice. The aircraft assigned to the flight was a Boeing 747, a giant of the skies, known for its reliability and strength. It had flown many times before. It had carried thousands of passengers safely. There was no obvious reason for anyone to fear it. On that day, 524 people boarded the aircraft. Among them were families returning home, businessmen finishing their work trips, and children traveling with their parents. Flight attendants greeted them warmly, helping them find their seats. Outside, the sun was beginning to lower, painting the sky with the colors of evening. At 6:12 p.m., the aircraft lifted off the runway at Tokyo's Haneda Airport. The takeoff was smooth. The climb was normal. Inside the cabin, nothing felt unusual. People settled in for the short journey, unaware that their lives were already hanging by a thread. Then, at 6:24 p.m., everything changed. A violent explosion echoed through the aircraft. The sound was sudden and terrifying. Passengers looked around in confusion and fear. The plane shook violently, and within seconds, oxygen masks fell from the ceiling. The aircraft had suffered explosive decompression. The rear pressure bulkhead had failed catastrophically, and the force of the explosion destroyed the vertical stabilizer, the tail fin that keeps the aircraft stable. Without it, the plane was no longer fully controllable. Inside the cockpit, the pilots immediately knew they were facing a nightmare scenario. The aircraft was responding abnormally. The controls felt wrong. The plane began to climb and descend unpredictably, as if it had a mind of its own. The pilots declared an emergency. They tried everything they could to stabilize the aircraft. They adjusted engine power. They fought against the plane's movements. They struggled to maintain control. But the aircraft refused to obey them completely. Inside the cabin, passengers were experiencing something they had never felt before. The aircraft was moving in strange, unnatural ways. It would suddenly rise, then fall. People were thrown in their seats. Some began to cry. Some prayed. Some sat in silent shock. As the minutes passed, a horrifying realization began to spread among the passengers. This was not a normal emergency. This was something worse. Some passengers began writing messages to their families. They wrote on pieces of paper, on the backs of magazines, on anything they could find. They wrote goodbye. They wrote words of love. They wrote apologies. They wrote their final thoughts, knowing these might be the last words they would ever leave behind. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the pilots continued fighting. For 32 minutes, they refused to give up. They struggled to keep the aircraft in the air, hoping to reach a safe landing. But the damage was too severe. The aircraft continued flying, but it was slowly losing the battle against gravity. At 6:56 p.m., the inevitable happened. The plane slammed into the side of a mountain. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft was torn apart. Fire erupted. The force of the crash destroyed almost everything instantly. Hundreds of lives ended in a single moment. But not all of them. In the darkness of the mountain, some passengers were still alive. They were injured. They were in pain. They were trapped in the wreckage. And they were waiting. Rescue teams knew about the crash. They knew the aircraft had gone down. But the crash site was remote, deep in the mountains. It was difficult to reach, especially at night. Hours passed. The survivors waited. They listened for rescue teams. They called out for help. Some could hear others crying. Some could hear voices in the darkness. But help did not arrive. Not that night. It wasn't until the next morning, nearly 14 hours later, that rescuers finally reached the crash site. By then, it was too late for most of those who had survived the initial impact. Out of 524 people, only 4 were found alive. 4 survivors. 520 did not make it. Investigators later searched for answers. They needed to understand how such a disaster could happen to an aircraft that was supposed to be safe. What they discovered was both shocking and tragic. Years before the crash, the aircraft had suffered damage to its rear pressure bulkhead. It had been repaired, but the repair was done incorrectly. At the time, no one realized how dangerous that mistake would become. Over the years, every flight placed stress on the damaged structure. Slowly, invisibly, the metal weakened. Until finally, on that August evening, it failed completely. The explosion that doomed Flight 123 was the result of that hidden weakness. It was not caused by weather. It was not caused by pilot error. It was caused by a mistake that had been waiting for years to reveal itself. Among the wreckage, investigators found the goodbye letters written by passengers. These letters became some of the most heartbreaking evidence of the tragedy. They were messages filled with love, fear, and acceptance. Messages written by people who knew their time was running out. Japan Airlines Flight 123 remains the deadliest single aircraft accident in history. But beyond the numbers, beyond the investigation, beyond the technical explanations, what makes this tragedy truly haunting is those 32 minutes. 32 minutes where people faced their mortality. 32 minutes where hope slowly faded. 32 minutes where hundreds of lives hung in the balance. And in the end, only 4 survived to tell the story. The rest became part of one of aviation's darkest chapters. A flight that took off like any other, a flight that should have landed safely, but instead became a nightmare in the sky, and a reminder of how fragile life can be at 35,000 feet above the ground.